Hello, my name is Kei Ueda. I'm curator of the Japanese Diaspora collection and a research fellow at the Hoover Institution Library and Archives, Stanford University. The Hoover Institution and the Japanese Association for Migration Studies are delighted to welcome you to Professor Sheldon Garon's talk, Through a Transnational Lens, Embedding Japan in Global History, as part of the second international workshop on the Japanese diaspora. Tomorrow's workshop encourages rising young scholars to present their new research on Japanese global migration. To sign up for the webinar, please visit our workshop website. We also like to thank the director of the Hoover Institution, Condoleezza Rice, for her support of the library and archives and our programs. And also like to thank the endowment donor of the Japanese Diaspora Initiative, overseers of the Hoover Institution, our board of directors, and other donors, without whose support, nothing we do would be possible. Now, just a few housekeeping notes. At the end of the presentation, we'll open the program for questions and answers. For in-person participants, please raise your hand if you have questions. For remote participants, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen to type your questions. The webinar is recorded, and the recording will be made available for post-event viewing. Without further ado, now let me introduce you to Professor Sheldon Garon. Sheldon Garon is a Nissan Professor of History and East Asian Studies at Princeton University. A specialist in modern Japanese history, he has explored state-society relations in the areas of labor, women's movements, prostitution, welfare policies, and religion. He also writes Transnational Global History that spotlights the flow of ideas and institutions between Asia, Europe, and the United States. His book, Beyond Our Means, Why America Spends While the World Saves, received global attention because it suggests what Americans might learn from past and present policies to encourage household saving in Europe and East Asia. Other books include Molding Japanese Minds, The State in Everyday Life, and The State and Labor in Modern Japan. He's currently writing a transnational history of home fronts in Japan, Germany, and Britain in the two world wars, focusing on aerial bombardment, food security, and civilian morale. He received the Humboldt Research Award and has held fellowships from the Paris Institute for Advanced Study, Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation, Leeuwenhoek Trust, and Woodrow Wilson International Center. Now let's welcome Professor Sheldon Garon.
Thank you very much, Kay, and thank you also to my other colleagues who have issued this very kind invitation. And I also want to say thank you to all of you who are coming for this conference on the Japanese diaspora. You're going to see that I know a little about things like migration and Pacific history, but not that much. So I'm very eager to hear from you as I expand my own interests globally. And this is an area I don't know much about. Well, my talk tonight is based on a recent essay that appeared in Journal of Japanese Studies. It was addressed to historians of Japan, and in a sense, it was a manifesto to my field, Japanese history, to do more to situate Japan within a more global framework. Now, I've been working on transnational and global history for some time, and this seems like a good time to assess the state of this still fairly new field with respect to both Japanese history and history in general. So let me begin with some very quick introduction, sort of a user's guide to transnational and global history. We start with a book by a colleague of mine in Germany, a wonderful book, Sebastian Conrad, What is Global History? So I'm going to ask the question in a similar way, but I'm going to ask, what is transnational history? Now, in my own work, and tonight you'll see this as well, I tend to use transnational and global history interchangeably, and it's for some fairly good reasons. Both transnational and global history tend to go beyond comparative history to emphasize connections. I mean, that's sort of their base. Both of these histories chart the movements of ideas and institutions, peoples and practices, commodities across borders and oceans. Yet I see some subtle differences between transnational history and global history. First, transnational history, the word nation is in it, it presupposes nation states. So that's a certain limiting factor. It's a little hard to do a transnational study of the medieval world, for example, when there aren't clear nation states. So it's bounded in time. It's a fairly small distinction, but one would tend to use global history more for pre-modern topics as well as for modern topics. But also, while it's possible to do transnational history within one region, and one can think of a lot of good transnational studies on various countries in Europe, what makes transnational history global, as it were, is when we start to go beyond one region and we start to examine we call now increasingly trans-regional connections. Now, what are trans-regional connections? Well, it seems to me that many of you are doing one of them now, the Pacific world. This is really a way of reimagining space, because we've got lots of countries and regions that are usually studied in isolation from each other. I mean, whether it's South America or North America or East Asia or Australia or Island Pacific. So this is a way of connecting and reimagining spaces, and reimagining them for historians, because as you know from your own case studies, people at the time didn't have to reimagine them at all. People were moving around, and that's the point. It's a history that's often missing, but it's what I think trans-regional history can give us. And another example, and there's so many examples, is increasingly the work on the Eurasian world. So we're starting to see a number of good books, for example, on Russian relations or Soviet relations with Japan, with Korea, with China. Again, in ways that seem sort of obvious when you look at the map, but we just don't organize our academic study in an integrated way. People are doing Russia, people are doing East Asia. So these are ways of bringing it together. And it makes transnational history more global, more transregional. Well, some of the recent move toward transnational history has been very fruitful. I mentioned, for example, the transnational studies inside of Europe, between countries. It's been very fruitful. But in other areas, and this is my opinion, transnational history still suffers from a certain faddishness and is yet to realize its promise. And maybe I shouldn't do this here, but the US history is one of those fields that for at least the last 15 years, we have Professor Osma in the room, and he's a big exception. But for the most part, US historians have talked a lot about transnational history, and some of it has been quite promising. I think work on the borderlands, I think increasingly work on the Pacific. But a problem, as some of you know, with American history, at least as it's practiced in the United States, is that the American historians of the United States don't tend to know foreign languages. They don't tend to know others' histories. And frankly, in my personal experience, often they don't seem to care. So that's a problem. And so we get some transnational studies, and this is probably unfair. But there's one called the Wilsonian moment. It's gotten a lot of attention, and it is actually by somebody who does use foreign languages. And yet, it's kind of a typical case in which, rather than seeing all the lateral connections among his cases, we see President Wilson radiating out to the rest of the world. So a lot of the transnational history of the United States has been about how America is reflected in the rest of the world rather than how it's connected with the rest of the world. Also, and it gets beyond the bounds of American history, but in terms of space, transnational history has tended to remain centered on either Europe, the North Atlantic, or some of the European empires. And the exclusion of East Asia, and especially Japan, I would argue, has been a glaring gap. So I would argue, and this is my argument tonight, and this is my argument in life actually right now, is that the inclusion of Japan in global history can be beneficial in important ways. Why is this? Well, why is the inclusion of Japan important? Well, I would argue that modern Japan has been among the world's most energetic transnational learners, and actors. Uh, Japanese, from the time of the Meiji Restoration, sometimes even a little before Meiji Restoration, have been vigorous and systematic investigators of other nations, looking at all sorts of things, from ideologies to institutions. Lots of investigation going on, both by state and society in Japan, of other countries from at least the Meiji Restoration. And these systematic investigations actually can tell us a lot about the global circulation of ideas and institutions far beyond just the Japanese nexus. In other words, just looking at the reports that are issued by Japanese investigators and those curious about the rest of the world actually help us to more clearly see the global currents in the world. So it's again going beyond Japan itself. So that's one reason to study. And I'm also convinced that scholars of Japan can make valuable contributions to global history if we start thinking more transnationally about our own case of Japan. And in the article I wrote, I said we should exploit our comparative advantage. And I'm not talking about Ricardo here. I'm not talking about economics. I'm just making a little pun. We should exploit our advantage to compare, okay? Because our Japanese actors often are actively comparing themselves and connecting themselves with others. So we can do that. And then there's some practical issues. Those of us in Japanese history, and you might say this is the same thing in Chinese history, we've already mastered one of the more difficult languages in the world. We've mastered Japanese archives. And usually, at least in high school and early college, we maybe know at least one European language, and some people know a second Asian language. So we sort of have to leverage our skills because if you think about it, it's a lot easier for us with a firm base in the hard case of Japan to learn more about America or Europe or other places than it is for an American historian or European historian to suddenly discover Japan. So I think we're in a position where we can contribute a lot. Also, I think there's a benefit for transnational history to Japanese history itself. I think it offers important contributions to Japanese studies. Because once you start looking at things globally or transnationally, and you start looking at Japan in that framework, it starts to challenge a lot of the myths of Japanese exceptionalism. So many of the things in Japan that we think are just so uniquely Japanese were actually formed as part of encounters with other nations. And so that's another contribution. Now, okay. So there's no one formula for writing transnational history, but I propose here some guidelines that I think will allow us to better realize the promise of transnational history. So one point to be made, and I think it's an interesting point for your conference, is that transnational doesn't necessarily mean transcending the nation state itself. That was a kind of a common misunderstanding when this word transnational started to be used a lot in the 1990s, that it meant that one would focus exclusively on so-called non-state actors. Now, it's a good thing to focus on non-state actors, and it's a good thing to sometimes think about where the nation state is not present in encounters. So migration seems to be a very nice case. There's a very good book in Japanese history that's about connections between Japanese anarchists and Russian anarchists. And if you think about it, an anarchist is kind of like your ultimate non-state actor. So it's a good thing to focus on these non-state actors, but in a great many instances, even in migration, and I've learned from Professor Azuma and others, that the nation state sometimes is quite present. So, and in other areas, nation state is often a very major actor in transnational history, and particularly related to Japan. When Japan connects itself with other places, particularly with places outside of East Asia, the distances are far. And it's not like every ordinary Japanese can just like get on a boat in 1900 and go investigate some cases in Europe. You often need very strong institutional sponsorship. In the Japanese case, often this is state sponsorship. So we have to understand the nation state can often, not always, but often be a central actor in transnational history. Now, another guideline I would say for doing good transnational history is we have to go beyond the bilateral connection or comparison. I think that tends to distort our findings and it stops us from seeing really the more global circulation of things. So, for this group, or for many people who study Japan in this country, US Japan is almost always the unit of comparison. Uh, well, that's okay. And in terms of connections, that can be okay. But there are many countries in the world and many regions, and what you find when you start looking at the documents, and some of you have probably seen this as well, is that lots of other peoples and nations appear, and that the Japanese at the time know this. They know that the US isn't the only country in the world. It's only the US that thinks we're the only country in the world. So it's good to broaden the frame. I mean, if you can just sort of visualize this, I didn't put a map up here, but you have the Pacific Ocean, and like most people who study Japan in this country, their frame, just how they look in visually is they just look at the west coast of the United States and Japan, and that's the only world they got. But you got to zoom out. And when you zoom out, or when you change the camera focus, then maybe you're going to see Japan, Russia. Maybe you're going to see Japan, Southeast Asia. Maybe you're going to see Japan, Europe, the more you zoom out. So it is good to have, I would say, at least 3 cases. It sounds a little daunting, but it's not that daunting. Particularly, you can use English for some of them. But the whole point is to think more broadly, to broaden that lens in a sense. And finally, in terms of practicing global or transnational history, Sebastian Conrad, in his book, What is Global History, reduces this to a very nice formula, I think, called the 3 C's. Kind of what sort of the basic minimum for doing transnational or global history. Well, the first is connections. And connections, we're going to come back to that. You'll see Getting Global History Right. I'm going to come back to that too. But you obviously want to look at the actual connections, and you want to look at the agents in the connections. You don't want to just assume a connection. You want to see how things are being connected up, and you want your connection to be pretty important. That's why Getting Global History Right. There's all sorts of mundane connections. You can spend your life on them, and they don't really make any difference. They don't explain that much. So first C is connection. Second C is comparison. Even though I said that global history or transnational history goes beyond comparative history, it includes comparative history. If you want to do good transnational history, you still want to think contextually and comparatively about what's happening on each side of the connection. Why, if you have flows, transnational flows, does things turn out differently in one place than another? I mean, I'll just give you an example that maybe some of you do the Pacific might find interesting. There was a lot of transnational circulation of ideas of nation building and military strengthening in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Japan happens to take a lot of that information and to, you could say, operationalize it rather rapidly, becoming a great power. A lot of that information is also available to emerging nation states in South America, places Argentina, Chile, Brazil, probably most prominently. They take in some of it, but it's interesting. None of them turn out like Japan. None of them become a great power. So the connections are one thing, the transnational flows are one thing, but you still got to do the comparative work into why does it happen in one place and happens differently in another place. So that's the second C. And the third C, and this is very important, is causality, which means what in the world do these connections explain? So as I said, you can spend a lot of time on a connection, and then at the end of the day, ask yourself the question, well, so what? Okay, maybe the connection doesn't actually tell you that much. So you have to think, if I'm going to do this connected history, what is the value added in it? What does it contribute? What does it explain? So those are the three C's. And well, maybe I'm being doctrinaire here, but I think if you leave any of those C's out, you're not going to write very good global or transnational history. You really have to have all three. And again, this is one of my major indictments of the so-called US transnational histories. They don't really care about what's happening on the other side. Oh, that's not, oh, and it's a webinar too. And I knew I wasn't supposed to say that. I'm so sorry. Okay, I retract that statement. Yeah, whatever. Okay, anyway. Okay, so to illustrate the benefits of transnational history, so what I'm going to do in the rest of the talk, rather briefly, is I'm going to draw on two of my recent research projects and show how, in a sense, I practice transnational history. So the first is the book that Kei Ueda mentioned. Okay, and look at the cover very carefully, or at least the subtitle very carefully. Japan's not in it. Okay, it's Why America Spends While the World Saves. Okay, Japan's in the world, obviously, and Japan's in 4 or 5 chapters of this book, so Japan's in a lot of it. But I didn't mention it at first, and it's interesting that even though it doesn't appear in the final title, I originally was going to write a book about campaigns to get people to save money, and it was going to be exclusively about Japan. So the book really evolved into a global history. So let me explain what happened. The Japanese maybe you don't know anymore, maybe because it's changed a little bit. The Japanese used to be very famous for saving a lot of money. Okay, so in the 1970s, they were like the world's greatest saver, and Americans are wringing their hands about how the Japanese economy was doing so well because people were saving and it was being invested, and they weren't, and all that. So anyway, the Japanese are famous for saving a lot. And most Japanese, and frankly most Americans, assumed that this thrift that they had was an essential part of Japanese national character, something rather unique to Japan. But as I started researching this 100-year history of efforts to get people to save money and economize, I soon realized that Japanese savings behavior was actually significantly formed not just out of culture, but out of active intervention by the modernizing Japanese state and by several savings institutions that I'll talk about in a few minutes, that, in other words, enabled people to save money. And moreover, I realized that the state policies and these institutions, in many cases, were adopted in conscious emulation of what Japanese investigators at the time saw as European practices and thinking that made European nations strong. So we're talking about the late 19th, early 20th centuries. So for example, postal savings. These aren't things we talk about that much anymore, but a generation ago, we were obsessed with this. The Japanese Postal Savings Bank about 20 years ago was like the world's largest bank, if you can believe that. It's still extremely large. And most Japanese, I think, assume that the postal savings system they have originated with the Emperor Jimmu and, coming down from the sun goddess, okay? That it was something just primordial, innate, because the Japanese were just so exceptionally thrifty. But as it turns out, the postal saving system in Japan was adopted very consciously by the new Meiji government in 1875, based on what they saw in Britain and to some extent what they saw in Belgium. Those were the 2 postal savings banks at the time, and they were in the world of social and economic policy. The British Postal Savings Bank was seen as something that was extremely innovative in getting the working classes to save, to make them more orderly, to generate investment. So the Japanese were very consciously borrowing this, and you can see, if you go to France, which I've just been in the last year, the La Banque Postale is, it's everywhere. It really rivals the Japanese system. The whole point is these things are evolving as part of a circulation of knowledge in which states and societies are looking at each other. Another one that might really bring us down to the level of everyday life. Japanese children, particularly in the 20th century and early post-war decades, were rather famous for being regimented in school to bring in their yen each day and each week and to deposit in their postal savings account. And this was seen as an inculcation. It was seen as something very either Japanese or Confucian. But the idea of molding children's behavior to do all sorts of things, including in this case, saving and economize, this was a big part of late 19th century nation building and society building all over the world. And again, you would find it in places like Belgium and France and Germany. I just show you these very similar images from around the world. From Munich to Melbourne to my home state of Minnesota, where everybody is, lining up in a very orderly way. Almost an East Asian way, except they're not East Asians, okay? In other words, it's part of this shaping of morality and everyday life that's going on all over the world, and which again, Japanese investigators are seeing in the late 19th century and saying, well, for Japanese nation building and strengthening, we need similar institutions. So it's a transnational form here, but it's extremely important in kind of the mundane aspects of everyday life. And it's really remarkably standardized. Now, so in addition to showing that the Japanese were emulators, I also what I also learned from this in looking at the Japanese investigation of these global currents, that it's not like the Japanese are the only people who are emulating. This practice of emulation is very much that's okay. The practice of emulation is very much part of, again, the modernizing nation states from the 19th century on, even before the 19th century. I mean, you see it in early modern Europe as well. And so by looking at how the Japanese are participating in these global currents, you actually see how everybody else, in a way, is similarly engaging in transnational learning and investigation. There's nothing particularly exceptional about the Japanese in being very active transnational learners. And in other words, what it also suggests is this whole process of learning and emulation. It's not a unilineal thing. It's not a unidirectional thing. It's multidirectional, in which countries are learning from other countries, then countries are learning from them. And so I give you some examples that at times Japan was not only a taker of ideas, but was a maker of transnational knowledge. So interesting cases that I think some of you probably might have experienced in your own cases is when Japan first really becomes a serious model for transnational emulation is at the time of the Russo-Japanese War. And it's this period when Japan, having surprisingly beat this European power, Russia, for various reasons, interesting comparative reasons, becomes quite attractive to some other countries who are seeking to revitalize themselves, particularly the British. So in the early years of the 20th century, there's a national malaise in Britain. They've been humiliated in the Boer War in South Africa. They see Germany rising very fast. And at this point, this is about 1904, 1905, a couple of years before, 3 years before, the British have made an alliance with the Japanese, the Anglo-Japanese alliance. And so when the Japanese defeat the Russians, they start to become a much talked about model of what the British called national efficiency. So the book on the left is really fantastic book, a guy named Alfred Stead, a British journalist. Great Japan, it's a takeoff of Great Britain. Great Japan, a study in national efficiency. And what Stead and others at the time do is they see Japanese models as alternatives for all sorts of things that ail the British. So the British are worried that they've sort of just evolved into partisan warfare and stalemate and gridlock, and they see the Japanese as being unified behind national goals, military strength, education, the health and welfare of its people. They're also very impressed with their observations of the Russo-Japanese War that, in a sense, the Japanese are seen as one of the first nations to actually construct a real home front. They didn't use the word home front at the time, but they talk about the mobilization of civilians. The British accounts, like Stead, talk about how efficient the Japanese were in the Russo-Japanese War in not only mobilizing soldiers, but mobilizing civilians at home, men, women, and children, to save money, to take care of the wounded, to make sacrifices for the nation. So this is seen as very attractive, this idea of an efficient nation, a national efficiency. And it's interesting just to show how circular things are. We take the concept of Bushido, the samurai. Now, Bushido has gone down in history as a sign of sort of age-old, timeless, primordial Japanese militarism and atavism. But those were not its origins in its modern form. Of course, Bushido in the Tokugawa period did mean a code of the samurai, but it was never applied in the Tokugawa or early Meiji period to the rest of the nation because it would be outlandish to suggest that 95% of the Japanese populace, the peasants and poor urban people, had anything to do with samurai. So how does Bushido get applied to the entire nation? Well, it's not like this. It's not this just age-old thing. It goes back to the person who first popularized the idea of Bushido in the Western world. Wait a minute. I'm ahead of myself. Actually, to show how Bushido sinks roots in Britain, to some extent America, H.G. Wells, the great science fiction writer, he's part of this cult of national efficiency. He writes a book in 1905, right at the time the Japanese are winning the Russo-Japanese War, Modern Utopia. And in his Utopia, the guardians of Utopia are called the samurai. So thus you get the order of the samurai, not to be sure he doesn't look very Japanese. But it's how Bushido, which we think of as so exceptionally Japanese, actually becomes internationalized. And the British say, hey, that's really cool. We want some of it too. Okay, so what does this mean? How does Bushido become circular and capable of being transplanted? Well, we go back to the source. As I said, the person who popularized the idea of Bushido in the West and then in Japan, actually, because it happened first in the West, because he wrote it in English, is this man, Nitobe. Okay, Nitobe Inazo in the Japanese word order. And some of you may know this book. In 1899, he writes it, Bushido, the Soul of the Nation, and he writes it in English. Doesn't get translated into Japanese until 1908, but he writes it in English. And the introduction is a real kicker because he's quite honest. He explains his thought process. First of all, he says it's the same as chivalry. Okay, so that's interesting. So you see, he's already drawing on kind of a transnational connection. But he explains, and I won't read the whole thing, but he's got this pal, a Belgian jurist, and the Belgian jurist is mocking him and, saying, you Japanese, you don't have Christianity. So how are you supposed to impart the moral values to your children? And it's interesting that he said the question stunned me at the time. I could give no ready answer. So it's interesting. He couldn't give a ready answer. He had to think about it. And then I began to analyze. So it wasn't exactly on the tip of his tongue. It was this transnational thing where he's trying to find an analogy. He's been challenged. And Japanese are here. He's being directly challenged. Usually the challenge is a little more indirect, but like, how do you Japanese slot yourself into the world? And he's saying, it's Bushido. That's it. It's Bushido. Okay, so that's the equivalent. Okay, and then the next sentence is kind of revealing too. The direct inception for this little book is due to the frequent queries put by my wife. I put in brackets. She's from Philadelphia. She's a Quaker. Okay. In other words, he's got to put what he thinks is going on in Japan within a transnational framework. And it goes from there, and then it develops like Topsy, because it spreads all over the place. Westerners are trying to figure out why the Japanese defeated the Russians, and the only book they got on their shelf in English is, it's kind of like an American historian, but anyway, the only book they got on their shelf is Bushido in English. Okay, so they say, yeah, it's Bushido. So right, and then okay, cycling back becomes a major precept of the Boy Scouts. Okay, Britain's Baden Powell. Some of you may be familiar with him. He's a military man. It comes from the Boer War and all the humiliations. He decides the British boys need manning up, basically, and they need chivalry. And so in his guide to the Boy Scouts, it's a little hard to read here, but he says, unfortunately, chivalry with us, the British, has to a large extent been allowed to die out. Whereas in Japan, for instance, it is taught to children. It is taught to children. Sorry. That's my eyesight. So taught to children so that it becomes with them a practice of their life. And it is also taught to children in other countries with the best results. So you just get to see here that we're not just talking about something exceptional. We're talking about something very international, transnational. Okay. Let's see. How am I doing on time?
You're still good. Yeah.
Okay, all right. I'm coming to a close here, but so that was the first case. So it's about saving, it's about inculcation of values, it's that transnational story. And thinking transnationally is equally useful in the current book that I'm writing, which is on basically civilians in war. It's on home fronts. It's on both the defensive home fronts and the attacks on home fronts. And I'm centering on three countries, Japan, Germany, and Britain. Although the United States comes in with a sort of a cameo appearance as the bomber, because they're the ones who are destroying all the home fronts. But so it's basically these three countries. And so the premise of my book is that the Second World War, you might have heard the word world in it, it's a global experience. And yet, histories of the Second World War tend to either focus on Europe or on Asia Pacific, but moreover, histories of the home fronts are generally limited to individual nations. So you go to a British museum and it's on Britain's finest hour, and you go to an American exhibit and it's on America's greatest generation. You go to Japan's home front museum called the Showa-kan, and it's all about the exceptional hardships of the Japanese people during the war. They're all limited to individual nations. I argue, on the other hand, that the very concept and the practices of the home front were actually transnationally constructed in the period from the First World War through the interwar years and to the Second World War. In other words, nations were very vigorously learning from each other on what would constitute a home front. In what forms would you see the mobilization of civilians that were so important to sustaining these protracted wars? And in this this phenomenon of transnational construction of home fronts, the Japanese, believe it or not, they play a leading role, even from the time of the First World War, when Japan itself plays a pretty minor military role, but they're very active investigators. They send lots and lots of civil and military bureaucrats to Europe, to a lesser extent the United States, during the First World War, and they come back with voluminous reports that actually become part of influential government commissions and policies in the 20s and 30s. And so what do the Japanese see? Well, they see what everybody else is seeing, but the Japanese actually see it more coherently, perhaps because they're not in the middle of it. They're just kind of going from country to country. They're very good at distilling and synthesizing. But so what are they saying? Well, first of all, they're seeing that morale and food can be extremely important on the home front. And for Japan, if Japan has a second, more total war, that food and morale are going to be big things they have to pay attention to. So they particularly remark on the collapse of home fronts in Germany, Austria-Hungary, which have a lot to do with food scarcity and then breakdown of morale. So they see that. They also, interestingly enough, they are fixated on the changing role of women in war in Europe in particular. So they go from country to country and they see this unprecedented mobilization of women for war, taking them out of domestic life, putting them in putting them in factories, making them bus conductors, delivering the mail, firefighters. So this is from one of these Japanese reports in 1917, which is actually explicitly on the mobilization of women. So they write several reports on the mobilization of women. So this becomes important. It becomes important to how the Japanese structure what I call moral suasion campaigns from that period on. So in the 1920s, the Japanese start a whole bunch of sort of modern savings campaigns with posters and things like that. Well, it's based on lots of the propaganda and posters they gathered in Europe. And I show this in particular because if you think that Americans don't learn anything from anybody, well, here's an example of where you get the same poster. The American one's a little nicer, but it shows this transferability. The fact that both countries they kind of merged their propaganda thing. It's the same poster, and the Japanese see these posters and others, and they see this idea that women are actually crucial. Up to then, Japanese women did not have a lot of role within state structures. But then from the period of the early 20s on, you see this active Japanese mobilization of women, constructing women's associations in every village and urban neighborhood, using them for state campaigns like this. So those are some of the things they see. And it's interesting that, again, the Japanese are not unique, and we just saw this in the British and American case. But because of this active learning process between countries from the First World War through the 20s, 30s, and into the Second World War, by 1941, if you had traveled around the world and you'd gone to liberal Britain and Nazi Germany and fascist Italy and Soviet Russia and Imperial Japan, you would have actually seen that their home fronts had lots of familiar features, lots of common features, despite the obvious differences in ideology. You would have seen savings campaigns everywhere. You would have seen ration coupons everywhere. So, things like rationing food and clothing and fuel. Well, this stuff really gets systematized in the First World War. So I show you an Austro-Hungarian one up here. I show you a British one. I show you Japanese woman in 1942. She's got her ration coupons out. The ration coupons all basically look the same. And that's not a coincidence, okay? They're gathering information about these things. And other things you would have seen, every country is trying to monitor what they call morale, a concept that 19th century, nobody would have known what you were talking about if you talked about the morale of civilians. Now every country is doing monthly morale reports because they're worried that morale will break down. There are air raid wardens everywhere because by the Second World War, bombardment of cities is a huge threat. So neighborhoods are being organized, whether it's Nazi Germany or Britain or Japan. In fairly similar ways. There are differences, obviously. You need to compare as well as connect, but it's remarkable how everyday life in war has been affected by what countries see around. And also, so we've been talking about the defense, but also in offensive strategies. The Japanese, just like everybody else, are learning, particularly from this new phenomenon called strategic bombing. So from the last years of the First World War, the European nations are beginning to bomb each other's cities with the hope that somehow it breaks down morale or forces the people to rise up in rebellion against their leaders and force them to negotiate. And these ideas of bombing cities and breaking morale, well, the Japanese Air Forces take this up. And in 1937 and 38, when the Second Sino-Japanese War starts, this is the biggest war between the two world wars. It's not appreciated, but it's the biggest war, the Second Sino-Japanese War. And it's interesting, the Japanese become the world's leading practitioners of strategic bombing. In other words, long-range bombing of cities that far away from their ground troops, trying to win wars simply by long-range bombing. And there's much interest. So here you see this is the German Air Force magazine, and they've got stories about the Japanese bombing. This is Chongqing, the old romanization. And the British in 1937 and 38, they hold a number of very high level, top secret investigations of the Spanish Civil War and the Second Sino-Japanese War in terms of what can the RAF, the British Air Force, learn from how the Japanese, the Germans, and the Italians are bombing their cities. And then particularly, they decide the Spanish Civil War is pretty low level, but they're very interested in how the Japanese are bombing and what they can learn from them. So we see very active processes, and we also see that because of the way I'm doing this, once again, as in the case of the savings book, we see that you can even take Japan out of it, and you can see how much countries are engaging in constructing their home fronts, conducting their strategy based on transnational learning. So this is Nazi Germany. Every couple of months, they did these elaborate press surveys on other countries' civil defense against air raids, in which you can see Japan as one of the countries, but there's several other countries as well. And finally, a point that and it doesn't mean finally for the whole talk, but I'm almost finally. Okay. Finally, at least for the talk, the section on the home fronts in the Second World War, there is the very interesting question of what transnational history might tell us about the role of race in the violence of the Second World War, violence against civilians. Now, most of you, I suspect, have read John Dower's famous book, War Without Mercy, in which he argues rather strongly that racism explains a lot. It explains, according to Dower, most of the violence in the Pacific War. And it's widely believed from Dower and others that racism also explains why and how the US firebombed 64 cities and atomic bombed 2 more during the last year of the war. So we have central Tokyo here, the aftermath of several of these raids. And the argument is that this is the sort of violence, the incineration, the use of napalm, that simply would not have been done by white people against white people, except it was done a lot. Okay, and so the Allies bombed, devastated about 200 German cities. I mean, very, very high levels of bomb and incendiary bombing. It was called area bombing. And what is interesting is, well, you can compare these photos and you can see, yeah, there's some differences. Most Japanese houses are made of wood, so they burn down, whereas here, the people get killed inside, but the wall's still there. But it doesn't matter because there's some small differences in technology and how you adjust your incendiary bomb, but they all go through the roofs, and they're all designed to dehouse, kill, and terrorize civilians, particularly workers. And how and why the Americans bomb the way they do in Japan is very much affected by what they learn from the bombing of Germany. So, in other words, we historians may not be able to connect the European and Asia Pacific theaters, but the bombers did a very good job of connecting. They went from one place to another, and they learned as they went on. Okay, so let me come to my conclusions. So as I've argued, transnational history enables us to think harder about global currents. My study of transnational home fronts makes me question whether we necessarily always have global history right. In other words, lots of historians purport to say these are the global currents happening at the time, but do they have it right? So the whole point is, by being better transnational historians, I think we have to think harder about this. And particularly, I'm going to give you the case of the 1930s. So in Japanese history now, it is the rage to write about fascism. Okay, so everything, many of my colleagues believe, can be explained, everything in Japan can be explained by the global spread of fascism. I'm a little dubious of that. Is that really the big current that's circulating around the world? Or you might remember Basil Fawlty and Fawlty Towers. Maybe these scholars have fallen into Basil's trap of don't mention the war. So a lot of this stuff on fascism doesn't seem to recognize that big wars are happening at the time and the preparations for big wars, and that these preparations for total war seem to explain a lot of the state interventions and mobilization of civilians much more than the more limited case of fascism. So, in other words, if you see the liberal British in wartime adopting some pretty authoritarian approaches to mobilization, and you see them in Soviet Russia, and you see them in Japan and Germany and Italy, it could be that it's not really fascism that we're talking about. Fascism may just be a category within this, but the big category seems to be total war. In other words, mentioning the war, that may actually be the global current. And if you can actually do the 30s and early 40s and not mention the war, that's pretty amazing, except you'd be amazed how many books now barely mention the war. So that's one example of getting global history right. And then another point I want to make is transnational history. As I said before, it allows us to challenge some of the essential explanations of culture or national character. So I'm going to close with an image here. This is an image not from Japan, but it's from Singapore. And let me explain for those of you who are a little young here. By the 1990s, as Asian economies seem to be growing at a very fast pace, many Asian thinkers and leaders would explain their rapid economic growth in terms of a heritage. Confucianism, or if you were in Southeast Asia, more commonly, it was Asian values. So in Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew was a longtime prime minister. He and the prime minister of Malaysia were always talking about Asian values. This explains why Asia is growing, why the West is degenerate, why discipline is broken down in the West, why the Asians are so disciplined. So images like this from Singapore, 1976, dutiful Confucian Asian children lining up, giving their savings. And okay, so is that an essential thing? Well, you got to remember back to the early part of the talk. They were doing this in Minneapolis, and they were doing it in Melbourne. They were doing it in Australia, which happens to be like Singapore, a British colony. So it might be an empire thing. Japan occupied Singapore in World War II, and after the war, it became a very dominant model for industrial development. In other words, my point is today that we cannot understand history simply by limiting ourselves to developments in one country. And examining the transnational flow of ideas and institutions, I would argue, sheds new light on the study of a modern world that was impressively interconnected. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Garon, for your thought-provoking and inspiring talk. Now we open the floor and as well as the webinar Q&As. I have already one question from the webinar participant. So what resource is good to learn more about the connection between racism and bombing on Japan?
Yeah, I think it's me. Sorry, but I hate to say it, but there's very little done on this. The Dower thesis has been overpowering, and it's almost a little heretical today, particularly in the age we're in right now, to suggest that race was not the most important thing. I do have an article in Past and Present 2 years ago that makes this argument. I think I have a couple of things on that are open access. Also, there's a blog. But yes, it's very clear as I demonstrate that it's a learned process from literally white people bombing white people. Now, it doesn't mean that racism doesn't exist. I want to make that very clear. It also doesn't mean that the Americans weren't racist toward Japan. They were very racist, much more racist than they were toward Germany. And yet, when it comes to things like bombardment and the massacre of civilians, killing hundreds of thousands, race is not necessarily a central element. One could argue that war hatreds that are not necessarily based on what we think of as race are important. The British war hatreds toward the Germans grew to a point that they could easily entertain the bombing of German cities. So they didn't necessarily, we might not say it's racial, but certainly a war hatred. So yeah, I'm sorry, but that would be my answer. It just really hasn't been done much. And it's kind of, to me, so obvious, but people don't always see the obvious things.
Do we have any questions from the floor?
Thank you very much, Professor, for very instructive talk. My name is Facundo Garacino. I'm working in JICA Ogata Sadako Research Institute in Japan. I'm interested in your framework of transnational history. And at the end of your talk, you mentioned about empire, right? Like the British Empire connecting such as Australia and Singapore as a colony. And I was wondering, when you mentioned about what global transnational history allows us to do, you mentioned the three C's, like connections, causalities, and what was the causation, causalities, and connections, right? But I think another field that has been very active as imperial history, right? Imperial history also has shown very deep global connections. And my question to you is, how in your framework, how do you address empire building or empire as a global actor? Because much of your talk has been, I think, about nation building, but how does come empire in that question? Much of the nations you have mentioned, Japan, Britain, so were colonial empires during that time. So that would be my question to you, how you address empire into your framework.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question. I mean, it has many different answers. I mean, one of the things that I think is interesting is this new field of trans-imperial history. So I must confess, I'm not that satisfied with British imperial history. Okay, because that has been kind of the leading history, at least in, maybe it's because we read English, but no, but even I've been in France. There's nothing as large as British imperial history, and the Germans can't do imperial history because they didn't have a very long-lasting empire. So British imperial history is there, and I think a lot of my colleagues in British imperial history think that you can sort of isolate the global currents within the British Empire, and that leads to a lot of problems because okay, so you examine India, and you act like the only influence the Indians have is what their colleagues in Cambridge say, for example, and there's a lot of stuff like that, and they don't realize that kind of laterally. India's in Asia, okay? So, I mean, there's a lot of sympathy for Japan at various points, and there are intersections with Southeast Asia, and there are these other empires that are right next to it. So okay, so how can you actually examine Malaya without understanding it's in the same cultural sphere as what we today call Indonesia, but they're separated by European colonies? So I like the trans-imperial approach because then then you're really again you're sort of going beyond the one case and you're not siloing. But you're right. This huge question of nation versus empire, it doesn't have an easy answer. I must say, it's beyond the bounds of tonight's talk, but I'm a little dubious of the thesis that everybody's an empire and they don't think of themselves as nations. In the Japanese case, it's pretty interesting. Maybe this is too much for now, but the Japanese case, most Japanese don't experience the empire as much as a lot of these new empire studies suggest. They don't rub shoulders as much with other people in the empire as you would think. The numbers of people in Taiwan and Korea aren't that large. It's only really in the late 30s in total war, you get people settling in Manchuria. They're there for a very short time. Most Japanese who are out in the wartime empire are there for just a short time, not the formative years. And so I don't quite accept this thesis that Japan was this kind of multicultural empire until 1945 and then became a single homogeneous nation. And likewise, even the British Empire. There's a lot of stuff in my study on Britain in World War II, when the British are really in trouble and it looks like Nazi Germany, can invade or it's very close by and they're not doing well. And the Ministry of Information measures morale, and they measure what did ordinary British think about, the loss of Singapore and the fact that Australia is being menaced. And the answer that came back overwhelmingly is they didn't care. I mean, they were so concerned about themselves as a nation, their home island. So I think we have to be careful, but you're asking a more subtle question, and I'm not sure I'm going to get to it tonight, but that inside the empires too, there are processes that are going on. Um, I mean, food, things like that. So we have to think about them as empires. We have to think about how the empires rub against each other, the trans-imperial. But maybe that's a long-winded answer to what you wanted. Yeah, we could pursue it later, probably. A nice question. Yeah.
Do we have more questions from the floor? I have a couple from the webinar participants. Might be a tough one for historians because they are future looking. What kind of value or values do you think will spread out from Japan going forward?
Well, yeah, it's too bad you didn't ask me that in the 1980s. Then I would have had a lot of answers, you know, the Japanese educational system, the just-in-time system, labor management system, industrial policy. Well, industrial policy kind of spread. Biden just passed a law, but yeah, okay. So, but now we don't think about that anymore. I mean, I think in principle there are all sorts of interesting things done in Japan that at least the United States could pay attention to, but it doesn't seem to be happening. So I don't know. So the U.S. maybe not. I mean, Asia is more interesting, isn't it? And there, I think we do see the spread of Japanese things. It's hard to now in this day and age, since so many other countries have been economically successful in Asia, it's hard to just come up with a very discrete Japanese model now, because a lot of these things have been diffused, right? I mean, education has spread, sort of investment in human resources rather than kind of welfare approach, that's spread. So I think a lot has radiated from Japan over the decades, over the 20th century and early 21st century. There are some East Asian modes of doing things. So that may be the area that we see it the most.
Thank you for your talk. My name is Hiroshi Bata. I'm not a historian, but a sociologist. And my question is about the condition of emulation of the idea. I think that the example that you gave in the talk is kind of a successful case that successfully emulate or spread the idea from one country to the another country. But I wonder what would prevent or distort the emulation. I mean, I ask this question because recently I have read an article. I forgot the name of the author, but he argues that in the process of the state formation in European countries, they compete and then try to emulate the optimal practices within anarchical condition, which means which had no superpower in Europe. But so that they try to emulate optimal practices. However, when it comes to the state formation in Latin American countries, the situation itself has changed. They had already the world order was established, especially according to him, and then they had a superpower in the British Empire, so that they tried to emulate the best practices, but they couldn't adopt such practices. So that might be one condition of the emulation which prevent or distort that emulation. But I want to ask your idea about the condition of emulation.
Well, yeah, I mean, I actually referred to that obliquely at the beginning of my talk. If his thesis is right, then how does he account for Japan? Because Japan's rising at exactly the same time. So maybe that doesn't tell us enough. I mean, I know the Latin American case there are other explanations, but I don't think that one works.
But a few more questions from the webinar participants. Thank you so much for wonderful presentation. Researching this kind of history takes more time to do well. How can we make the case for the value of such research to colleagues who simply count citations? So how can we make the case for the value of such research to colleagues who simply count citations? Or you
I think I have to ignore the
have to
last
pass.
part. No, but I think there's an important question in there, but it got a little snarky at the end. The important question is, how do you persuade people who are very comfortable doing, let's say, nation-centered history to do this? And I don't know how you persuade. I mean, I haven't, have I? I mean, they're still doing it. I guess you say it's exciting I mean, it's very good for one's imagination to to fan out, get outside your comfort zone. It's actually great for travel. Uh, I get to spend time in a lot of nice places now because they're all my cases, So, but just not. I don't mean to be sarcastic about it. The fact is that when you move around the world, just like your actors do, you learn a lot. When you physically see the places that your actors do, you learn a lot. When you talk to your colleagues in other places, France, Germany, Korea, you learn a lot. So getting outside of your comfort zone, I mean, kind of like the Latin American thing. Okay, so his thesis is fine, except I guess he hasn't been to Japan. Or is he Japanese?
No.
Okay, so he hasn't been to Japan. Okay, but maybe if he did, maybe if he actually put that into his thought process, he'd come up with a more subtle thesis. So I don't know. I mean, it's liberating, but it's hard to persuade people to do this, and frankly, it's hard to set up a reward system for young scholars for doing this, and that's a big problem. I mean, this is an ambitious task. You'd want to come out with at least 2 or 3 usable languages. There are limits to what you can do in graduate school. And then when you get out, you can land between stools, right? I mean, you're neither fish nor fowl. That's why you want to make sure, I think, when you start out that you can do 2 cases well. You can't do 3 cases well at that point, but that you can do 2 cases well so that you really can get employed. And you might not get employed there are some positions now for transnational and global history, but it's more likely you're going to get a nation-centered position if it's history, for example, and you're going to want to make sure that you can do that nation history well. So you can't just be floating up in the stratosphere of global currents. You also got to be rooted if you want to get a job. I mean, you got to think about that. So that's not an answer to his question, but I think it's an answer.
I can't resist asking you this question. A question from the webinar participant. To what extent does the revolution of information technology and digital archives affect the studies of global and transnational history?
Yeah, nice question. It helps a lot. I mean, particularly in the pandemic, but it helps a lot if your resources are limited and you can't travel to every place in the world. Having some good archival data online is really, really helpful. You can do some of this.
Yeah, hi, Adam Farrell, Graduate School of Education. I really enjoyed your analysis, particularly the bi-directionality of the emulation and adoption specific to the Japanese case. However, I'm wondering if there's room for collaboration as well. We talked about connection and causality. Maybe there's a 4th C to add. Are there explicit examples that you can point to of collaboration? You mentioned the Japanese-British alliance early in the 20th century. Maybe there are others?
Yeah, that's good. I mean, I do that. I just didn't. I couldn't come up with a 4th C. You did. Very good. Yes, I mean, a lot of this. So in other words, it goes under the category, as I said, the agents of the connection. So establishing, if you see collaboration, that can be a very important way of doing it. And that's why I showed that slide of the Joan of Arcs in American Britain. That's active collaboration. I mean, they're sitting down in the same room, coming up with propaganda. But it's also true that when the Japanese send all these investigative teams to Europe, they're doing it as an ally, and they're a valuable ally. The British need them, Japanese destroyers in the Mediterranean. So part of it is the European allies have to agree to sharing information with the Japanese. So they're talking to military people, they're talking to civil bureaucrats, and they're doing it as part of an alliance. So that can be important. So in all sorts of ways, often the collaboration is, is a a central explanation of the connection.
Ali Reiser, scholar from Mindanao, Philippines. And thank you very much for your inspiring talk. I'm interested in your transnational history because my interest is transnational migration history. Can you expand a little bit about the concept with regards to its relevance to local history, which is usually overshadowed by national history, dominated by capital center scholarship, or in our case, Manila-centric history?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not the best person on this, but one of my colleagues in Australia, Tessa Morris Suzuki, has been pursuing this quite a bit, and talks about certain local civil societies in various nations actually link up over political issues, environmental issues, things like that, and so she's been able to chart some of that, and so. Yeah, I mean, there's like, a concept of international civil society. That's another way of doing it. I can't point to that many examples in Japan, although she has found some. They're pretty low level. I would imagine in Europe, where things are just a lot more contiguous, there's a lot more of the sort of border crossing, people to people. I don't think it's quite as big in the Japanese case, although you can find examples.
Hi, my name is Yuto Kunaga. Thank you for your fascinating talk. Now, at the end of your talk, you said it's important to look at the interconnectedness of different parts of the world. But at the same time, I think it is not easy to prove that interconnectedness. For example, you showed the posters of women supporting the home front, and the posters made in England and the United States and Japan, right? But when it comes to the posters made in Japan, there are people who made that poster. But in that case, you might have to prove that person learned or saw the posters in England or in the United States, right? So is there any difficulty like that to prove that direct, causal relationship between two artifacts, connected through the people who made it?
In this case, no. There actually are direct connections. All governments in World War I gathered each other's posters, and the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs gathered them. I think who's got them now? Todai, I think. Anyway, they had hundreds of posters that they gathered. The Japanese poster artists saw those posters. So yeah, and the British Imperial War Museum gathered posters, and the U.S. government for their savings campaigns. We actually can see all the things that they gathered from around the world. So it doesn't mean you can always do that. It doesn't mean that things are easily knowable, but with some effort, a lot of things are more knowable than we realize. And a lot of people just give up and say, well, you can't possibly prove the reception. Well, you can. You actually can.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
More questions from the webinar participants. This participant was fascinated to see similarities or the idea borrowings between in the postal savings and bond purchasing in different ads in different countries. And he also mentioned that he was seeing similarities in sewing machine ads before. And does this sort of idea borrowings, does it expand to different types of advertisements?
Clearly, I mean, very good question. So not everything is government. Some things are capitalism, and the sewing machine is a great example. So a lot of people have written books about the global spread of Singer sewing machine. So my colleague Andy Gordon has this book on Japanese sewing machines, but there's stuff in Europe, and it's not mundane. It's actually extremely important because they spread, but Singer sewing machine also introduces what in America we call installment purchase, or the British call hire purchase. In other words, like taking 3 years to pay for something rather than buying it outright. So sort of novel forms of economic practice spread alongside of this, and then they restructure everyday life, that all of a sudden it's affordable for households to have a machine in their house, and it affects gender roles as well, because a lot of that sort of sewing used to be done by men, and then now it's increasingly done by the woman in the home. So in all sorts of ways, that's a very transnational phenomenon.
Ichiro Ozuma from University of Pennsylvania. I really enjoyed your talk, and I do sort of a different version, kind of sort of a transnational history.
You do.
But from that standpoint, I want to kind of ask you maybe a different versions of global history that we tend to actually see more often. I think the global history that I tend to see kind of focus on like a network of trade networks and then commodity and all that kind of thing. Right? And you mentioned capitalism already. So my question is that is there like any kind of room or place for capitalism in your kind of version of sort of global history?
Yes, I mean, that's a very important point, and I suppose it's a difference between the way I do global history and many others do it, because I think they are more focused on capitalism, and obviously that's extremely important. I get sometimes a little uncomfortable with their accounts though, because again, I find them a little stratospheric. They see the world in which this kind of capitalism is up there in the stratosphere, and it's kind of moving around like a cloud, and then it's transforming each country. Now, it's not that simple, but they often kind of assume the connections rather than actually showing the connections. So, there's capitalism, okay, then things got restructured in Japan. And there's kind of a lack of agent that I don't, as I say, I find sometimes a little unpersuasive. It's true that I tend to focus more on power than economy, so I tend to focus on states more than capital. Obviously, these are two of the big forces in the modern world: modern nation states and capital. I mean, the reason I do what I do is not to say that they're wrong, but to say that there are things that they miss when they just focus on capitalism, and one of the big ones is war. I mean, war really restructures things, and in a much faster way than capitalism does. I mean, it's extremely competitive, and it's not just like whether you can sell more sewing machines, it's whether your nation's going to survive or not. So lots of resources get thrown into these wartime projects that capitalism couldn't actually afford to do. So not to say you can't do one with the other. You got to do both in a sense. It's just I've tended to focus on the sort of the state and the war side.
Actually, I have one question. If I may, you mentioned the sort of the international borrowings of ideas, particularly starting from the Russo-Japanese War. And what is the actual catalyst for that? Was that the better technologies to spread ideas? Or something else?
Well, okay. Well, certainly the background of this is, I mean, people have learned from each other for a long time. I mean, a long time. I mean, millennia. Okay, and we see practices spreading around the world. But obviously, there's been an acceleration in information. Particularly from the 19th century on, and lots of people have talked about this communications revolution, and we can talk about shipping, we can talk about steam, we can talk about the telegraph, we can talk about the telephone, we can talk about underwater cables, we can talk about wireless radio transmission. All of these things increase circulation of knowledge. So there's that. But again, a big part, to my mind, is war. That, I mean, your specific questions about the Japanese and the Russo-Japanese War. Well, Westerners came to Japan for various things, for trade in the Meiji period. But it is amazing how many Western observers came to observe the Russo-Japanese War. And the reason was, again, it was one of the biggest wars between the American Civil War and World War I. And it didn't last that long, but a very major war with lots of resources and with lots of new technologies that Western observers, whether they were military men or doctors or nurses, they wanted to observe things like military medicine. They really wanted to observe what the Japanese were doing. The Japanese were very innovative. And it's also this moment, this global moment when there is tremendous anxiety among powerful nation states that they're going to have another war. And it's not going to be like the Napoleonic Wars. It's going to be much wider, and it's going to be with much more lethal technologies. It's going to be with machine guns. It's going to have all this stuff involved in airplanes, tanks, things like that. But anyway, it's this moment when there's a tremendous anxiety, and is your population up to it? Are they manly enough? Come back to the Boy Scouts, things like that. Worries about the revitalization. So it's in this moment that the Japanese have this success, and it's being very much observed. So I think that's part of it. And also for the British, they don't want to take Germany as their model because Germany's their enemy. So Japan becomes kind of a stand-in for Germany. Oh, the Germans are efficient too, but nobody's going to write one of those books about that. So there's a lot of things going on, but you have to, again, have a wide lens to see them.
I guess to expand your answer, there is a question about healthcare influence on interglobal connections. I think you touched upon it, but maybe could you elaborate a little bit more about that, because
They just said healthcare, or they were thinking of something more specific?
Healthcare.
Okay, well, I guess I could answer. I don't know what they meant, so I could answer in various ways. But I mean, here's an interesting case of why Americans don't do transnational well. So we are constantly, there's certain things that America is exceptional about, and it's not the things that American historians usually talk about. It's, it's things like we don't have very good transportation, we have no national health care policy, we don't have postal savings. There's a lot of things that make us almost the only country in the world that doesn't have these things, at least the only major country. So if you remember our healthcare debates, and this goes way back because we've had them at several points, but in the Clinton years and then the Obama years. You don't have to reinvent the wheel to come up with a national healthcare system. But any American president today who said, why don't we look at the Japanese healthcare system? It's one of the most cost efficient, delivering one of the best outcomes. Why don't we look at what the French do? Why don't we look at the Swedes do? They would be a one-term president. You can't, as an American political leader, talk about transnational knowledge. And it's gotten worse and worse. So, but in fact, in healthcare, I mean, that's a perfect example where we know that healthcare systems are very influenced by what nations see in other nations. That's probably not what they intended, but that's it's certainly one of these things. Social policy, all these things, they're very transnational.
I wanted to ask about something that you had brought up earlier about your distinction between all-out war as a governing system as being a sort of broad blanket term, and fascism being something that's sort of within that sort of larger conception. And I just wanted to ask if you could kind of speak a bit more about that, since this question of whether or not Japan was fascist in the 1930s and 1940s is such a big question. I'm just kind of curious.
Yeah, it has become a big question, and I can't quite figure it out because it's pre-Trump, even though obviously the Trump years have made this even more salient. But this kind of a global group of historians, but global, they're U.S. centered, but they look at various places in the world. They really want to establish that a country is fascist, that Japan is fascist, or at least that there is fascism in Japan, and that this makes a difference. So I don't understand the fixation, but two, a lot of the things they see as fascist are more widespread. So we talked about some of them, but it sounds like you've been reading some of this work. There's a lot of work on fascist aesthetics now, which is very interesting. So what are fascist aesthetics? Well, they show like people with strong bodies and, maleness and all that. Well, I can find you that poster in every belligerent in the Second World War. The Russians, the British, the bare-chested, manly man worker, he's everywhere. And the whole point is the cult of the body predates fascism. I mean, this is a big part of it. It's about hygiene. It's about the strengthening the body. I mean, historians have written good stuff about this. I mean, it starts late 19th century. It's about nutrition. It's about exercise. It's about the Olympics. It's about all of these things. It's about women being strong, and it just can't be explained by just fascism. Yeah, the fascists use it, but everybody uses it. I mean, it's just one example. It's just, I find, no, we're on the webinar. No, I'm not gonna say anymore. I just find a certain fuzziness in how this is being done, that they haven't broadened the lens, So if you look for fascism, if you drop your keys in the parking lot and you only look at where the light is, then you're not going to find your keys. You know that one, right? Okay. That's what I think this is.
I think that'll be probably last question.
Okay, I'm Shinya Yoshida from the University of Minnesota.
Oh, wow. That's my alma mater.
Well, a coincidence anyway.
Thank you.
Okay, the question that I have is who would be the centered on the global history of the transnational history of the emulation? Because I ask this question because I think it's not that everyone has global perspective or international connections, and I believe that it's a bit more easy to write a global history of emulation from the perspective of elites like policymakers or intellectuals, etc., etc.
Right.
So I'm wondering if the writing a history of the global history of transnational learning is possible from the perspective of nameless populace or audience. I guess the migration is a good example though.
Yeah, right. So that's a major critique of global history. One hears it a lot, that it only examines cosmopolitan elites, people who travel, people who read languages, and it doesn't cover the quote unquote those who are left behind. And my answer to that would be, that's not true, because those who are left behind are very much impacted by global currents, and often their lives change, their power relations change with the people around them. I'll give you some examples. As I said, one of my books was about saving money. So you have these kind of Victorian notions of housewifery are coming into Japan in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And a lot of them revolve around women being kind of the scientific managers of the household, keeping account books of savings and expenses. Well, you find that by 1930s, 40s, especially 1950s in Japan, you can go into a remote peasant village. And as a result of a lot of these campaigns, you've got like a Fujinkai, a women's association, and there are certain women, and they're pretty ordinary women. Maybe they're like the leaders of the hamlet, but we're not talking about high-level elites there. And they get cultural capital over being the best people who can keep account books, and then they teach other women how to do it, and they gain status from it. Well, it sounds really mundane, but these are global currents that go to the far reaches of the world. And then there's war. A global current, believe it or not, is being bombed. And you may think you were left behind, but you're not left alone because people are targeting you. And then you get caught up in these mobilization units, which again are global, civil, your neighborhoods, your Tonarigumi, your neighborhood association, and you have power over your neighbors if you're the local woman in charge of your Tonarigumi, if they're not doing their blackouts and they're not contributing to the civil defense, then you have the power to deny them food rations because you're the head of the Tonarigumi. Well, all of this is global. So I admire your question, but But a lot of this that's being asked, it's sort of asked with the assumption, of course, those left at home couldn't possibly be impacted by global currents. And I find the premise of the question unusual. I mean, I don't see why that would be.
I think we are at the hour. So thank you very much, Professor Garon, for your talk and answering all the questions. We hope you enjoyed today's talk. Thank you very much. And we look forward to seeing you either tomorrow's workshop or at our next event.